G'day YouTube. Hey, I'm here going to polish my glider. It's Saturday here in New Zealand and a nice wintry day. We have cancelled flying today. There's some lovely storm cell right beside us here, which I'll show you in a second. So I thought I'd take the opportunity to finish polishing my glider. We painted the glider over our COVID lockdown a few months ago, and it took about 8 weeks of work to get it painted. We did quite a bit of polishing at the time, but I didn't do the final polish and wax. So today we're going to finish that off. There's also just a tiny bit of sanding we have to do, just a fraction of sanding. Just on the side there, it's still a bit rough, bit of overspray from when we did the lettering. So I'm going to sand that down, cut and polish that. The rest of the glider has already been cut, but we still need to do a polish, a finish polish, and then a wax on top. I haven't waxed it yet, so that'll be good to do before we come into the flying season. So here's the kingpin of the polishing world. This is a Makita polisher, variable speed up to 3000 RPM. It's got a nice little chart here. So this thing is adjustable speed. You can adjust the speed here on the dial. And that's quite important because each different cutting and polishing compound needs to be run at a different speed. I've got here some of the different mats that I've been using. So we've got a couple of wool pads. We've got a fine polishing pad here, which I haven't actually used yet. And these are my old polishing pads. The wool pads are really good at cutting, and I found them to be the most effective. So for most of the work I've done on the glider so far has been with the wool pads. You can see my freshly painted blue lettering. So you've got to be a little careful about polishing any coloured things with the pads, otherwise you'll smear this blue all over your fresh white. So here's the polishing compounds I'm using. I'm using the Ferrecla Profile range. I got this because my previous glider had a gel coat finish, and this new glider has polyurethane finish. This Profile range will cope with both quite happily. They make other ones for cars, such as the G3 range, which we used on this glider as well, and it worked really well, but it's not designed for gel coats, whereas the Profile range is. There are a few different stages, so you can see we've got a cutting stage. I've got two bottles here, one's called Select, one's called Premium. One cuts a bit more than the other. The finish compound is what I'm going to be using today. I don't need to do much more cutting. And then the last one here is a UV wax. So, what's the difference? For the cut and the polish, it's really about how aggressive it is. The first step before any of this is actually wet sanding. So, that's obviously the most aggressive, to use sandpaper. When you sand, it leaves scratch marks. And so that's why you start off with a rougher sandpaper to actually do a lot of the work. And then you move up through the finer grades of sandpaper to hide all those scratches. Well, the same applies to the cutting compounds. So if you start with a rougher cutting compound, it will deal with bigger scratches from sandpaper than, say, the finishing compound. So the general idea is to do as little work on the wing as possible. So there's always a risk you'll take off too much paint if you sand or cut too much. So the only time you do a heavy cut is if you haven't done a cut or a polish for like 10 years and the surface looks terrible, or it's starting to crack and things, and the only way to save it really is to do a cut. Once your surface is in pretty good condition, then you don't need to do a heavy cut. You can just do a polish to get that nice shine and keep the luster of the wing. With polish, you can do more regularly. You are taking off a thin layer each time you do a polish as well, but it's less than a cut. It's okay to do a polish, say, once a year or once every couple of years. Depends how you store your glider, how much time it has outside, and all that kind of thing. If your wing is in pretty good condition, then you might be able to just get away with waxing. Now the wax here, this will only last a few months. It tends to wear off over time, just putting the covers on and off or washing the glider, it'll wear off. So you want to re-wax every few months if you can, and that provides a good UV protection. So I'm here, you can see we've got, well, you probably can't see very easily, but there's a line here of where the two edges of the paint are meeting. So I'm just going to use some 1200 and then 1500 sandpaper to smooth out that edge and get that down so it's nice and flat. It's only because we recently painted this and helped sand it, wet sand it and polish it. That gives me the confidence to do this. Otherwise I would have never taken sandpaper to my glider before this. But it's not too big a deal as long as you know what you're doing. And if you go too far, you can always paint more paint on. But I don't have the paint gear here, so I can't go too far. So we have to be very careful. Up here, you can actually see the dirt getting into it. And there we go. So there's the line here. All right, so that's 1200 done. Now I'm going to move to 1500 and just re-sand the bit I just did. And then it will be ready to cut and polish. Beautiful, that looks better. All right, so here we go. I'm going to polish this up now. Cut, actually, I'm going to do a bit of cutting just on the sides here because they really are not very shiny at all yet. So the way you do it, I've got my wool pad on here. I'm going to use the highest cutting compound mixture I've got. Give it a good shake before you put it on the pad. You want to just put on a little smidgen on the pad, just like that. Don't need too much. Less is more in this kind of situation. According to the instructions, we want to do this at 2,000 to 3,500 RPM with minimal pressure. There's about 3 on the dial there, so I've adjusted this so it's a nice medium speed. The other trick is to spread this around on the surface you're about to cover. You want to try and avoid spraying off all the actual compound. This is a bit awkward seeing it's down low, but we'll see how we go. Always have a rag handy so you can wipe this off as well. When you polish, it leaves a bit of residue on there. You want to get that off as soon as possible so it doesn't harden and dry into this horrible stuff that's hard to peel off. Notice I didn't do my lettering here. I'm trying to make sure we don't buff that with the with this thing. It's just too powerful. It'll rip the lettering off and smear out the blue onto the white. So instead I'll just do that by hand very carefully. Okay, so now we've done the cutting, we're going to switch over to our polishing compound and our polishing pad. These are just Velcroed on, so very easy. I haven't used this one yet, so that's very exciting. New pad. Beautiful. So I've got our number 2 polishing compound here. We'll see how that goes. It needs to be applied at 800 to 1100 RPM. So actually remarkably slowly. And you'll be thinking, man, is this actually doing anything? But I can assure you it does. So there's how fast it is. Quite slow. Slow is good, less dangerous. Now give it a smear on here so we don't quite swing it all off. One of the crucial tips is to never hold the pad in the same place for too long, especially at the highest speeds. What happens is it heats up, it'll warp the paint, and you end up with the texture of the weave underneath the fiberglass coming through to the paint. The only way to get rid of that is to do a very light wet sanding and repolish it. So it's quite important not to make the fiberglass and the paint too hot at any point. You want to keep it nice and cool, keep the pad moving, don't stop in any one place. And the slower you're doing this, the less chance of that happening there is. So let's demo with the nose here. So you can either apply to the pad or the surface, smear it around, get the stuff distributed so it doesn't all fling off as you turn on the pad. And then you just want to go back and forwards in a nice even pattern. Take your time, you don't need to move the pad around too fast. I'll often go over it again right at the end there just to make sure I've got all that residue off. So what have we done? Polished one wing and the fuselage Next, I need to polish the other wing. You can see the fuselage here has got a nice shine to it. Just polished by hand my lettering there, so that's looking pretty good too. So I thought I'd just show the amount of compound I'm putting on. Just a few little squirts. Tiny amount. You really don't need much. Just enough to smear around, and it works so well. Anyway, here's the bit I haven't done yet. And here's the bit I have done. Probably not a huge amount of difference, but and pretty hard to see in this light. So a little bit about the technique of using this. One very important detail. You'll notice it's spinning in a certain direction, and there's a big arrow on the machine here. So when you're putting this on the edge, like the edge of the flap here, you want to make sure that the edge going down is sweeping off the edge. You don't want it trying to pick up the edge. Otherwise, what can happen is this can grip on and rip the machine and possibly do some damage to you or the glider. So, get a bit of cutting compound here, polishing compound, smear it on, turn on the machine. You can see the spray you get here if you don't smear it around enough. Put it down, and it's quite safe to be on this edge this way around. You do not want to put it down this other way because it will grab on. Let's talk a little bit about the pattern of actually doing this on say the wing. What I tend to do is have the polisher on a slight angle, so this side here is making more contact than the other side. Now the reason is then you can really aim and control exactly where you're polishing. If you try and have the whole thing flat down, it also means when you wobble, the machine will want to grip one way or the other. So by having it slanted slightly, it's gripping this way, and you can just hold it steady. So to demonstrate, I'm just going to come up to that edge there. Now you notice, for that far edge, you want it leaning this other way. So there's no chance of gripping that edge. Once you're in a bit, switch it over to what you're doing normally. And I'm just doing a sweeping pattern back and forwards here, moving it towards me a little bit each time, making sure that the areas I'm covering overlap. Then I'll just come up and go over it again reasonably quickly. Now as we've done that, it's sprayed little particles of polish everywhere, so you need to wipe them up as quickly as you can. How does that look? It's got a nice sheen on it. Now you can see I can see a bit of polish that hasn't been wiped off properly there, so have a good look, make sure you get it all. Alright, I missed a bit back here, let's go and do that. Beautiful. Okay, I think we're ready for our third step, and this is the UV wax. So what this does is several things. It protects the gel coat or polyurethane paint from the UV, obviously. It also makes the wings quite slippery, so bugs are easier to clean off at the end of the flight. Water, if your wings get wet during the flight, the water will rush off it much more easily. And it makes it much more slippery and shiny, so if you put anything on, it'll just slide off. If you have covers that just drape over the top and don't actually wrap all the way around the wing, you'll find they slide off very easily. So anyway, let's go ahead and apply this. It's applied to the wings in much the same way as you do the polishing compound. So again, sparing amount on the pad. I use the polisher. It needs to be polished at 1000 to 1500 RPM. And you can do this by hand as well. All of these steps you can do by hand, but imagine how many motions of your hand you need to do the same amount of work as the polishing machine. So obviously a polishing machine is the way to go. Beautiful. A couple of really important details about polishing with the wax. First of all, make sure your tape's on when you're waxing. So if you're cutting and polishing, best to actually remove your tape so you can get in underneath the tape and make sure that's all polished as well. But the waxing, you don't want wax on where your tape's going to go, because obviously that'll make it too hard for the tape to stick. So make sure everything's taped up, make sure you've put your mylar on, make sure you've done your gap tape, and then wax on top of that, and then when you peel it off, it'll be nice and clean underneath and you won't have wax. Another important detail is the wax can clog up and block things. Now, holes might include things like static ports on your glider, so it's a good idea to tape them up. Also, if you've got blow-in wings, that means little pinholes at the bottom of your wing that the air goes out of while you're flying. You need to tape them up as well. Anyway, thanks for watching, and subscribe if you haven't already. If you have any comments on other products you can use, other tips and tricks, add them below, and it's useful for everyone. Okay, thanks for watching. Appreciate it.